The evening sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Amy Chen Rodriguez drove home from her volunteer shift at Memorial Hospital. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her blue hospital volunteer badge still hung from her white button-down shirt. The pre-med student had spent the last 6 hours helping elderly patients navigate the hospital's confusing corridors and translating for Spanish-speaking families. She was tired but satisfied, knowing she'd made a difference in people's lives. The dashboard clock read 7:45 p.m. when the police cruiser's lights began flashing behind her silver Honda Civic. Amy checked her speedometer. She'd been going exactly at the limit. With a small sigh, she pulled over to the curb, just as her father had taught her. Being the daughter of an FBI agent meant she knew exactly what to do during a traffic stop. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, interior lights on, and waited calmly. Through her rearview mirror, she watched Officer Brady take his time approaching her car, his hand resting casually on his belt. Something about his walk, his posture, made her stomach tighten with unease. "License and registration," he barked before even reaching her window. Annie noticed he didn't introduce himself or explain why he pulled her over, another red flag her father had warned her about. "Of course, officer," she replied politely, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her documents. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Officer Brady's face hardened as he looked at her license. His eyes flicked between her face and her ID several times, his expression growing increasingly hostile. "You don't look like a Rodriguez," he said, completely ignoring her question. "My father is Latino and my mother is Asian," Amy explained calmly, though her heart was beginning to race. She'd heard stories about Officer Brady from her classmates, none of them good. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered suddenly. "Officer, I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong." "I said step out of the vehicle." His voice rose sharply. "I can smell something suspicious." Amy's hands began to shake slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "Sir, there's nothing suspicious in my car. I'm coming home from volunteering at the hospital. You can call them to verify." "Oh, so now you're telling me how to do my job." Officer Brady's face reddened. "Exit the vehicle immediately, or I'll have to remove you myself." Amy knew her rights, but she also knew arguing would only make things worse. She reached for her phone, intending to call her father, but Officer Brady's reaction was immediate. "Hands where I can see them. Don't even think about it." The situation was spiraling out of control. Annie could feel tears building up behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Slowly, she opened her car door and stepped out into the cool evening air. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle," Brady ordered, his voice dripping with authority. "Officer, please." Amy tried one last time. "My father is FBI Special Agent Rodriguez. If you could just let me call him." "Oh, playing the daddy card now?" Brady sneered. "Turn around before I add resisting arrest to your charges." "Charges? What charges? I haven't done anything." But Officer Brady was already reaching for his handcuffs. The metal felt cold against Amy's wrists as he cuffed her roughly, ignoring her wincing at the tight grip. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, some people filming with their phones. Amy caught fragments of their whispered conversations, their shocked expressions. "I'm conducting a search of your vehicle," Brady announced, though he was already yanking open her car door. "Probable cause, suspicious odors and behavior." Amy watched helplessly as he tore through her car, throwing her medical textbooks onto the street, dumping the contents of her backpack onto the passenger seat. Her hospital volunteer badge fell to the ground, landing face up in a puddle. The sight of it there, her smiling photo now soaked and muddy, finally broke her composure. A single tear rolled down her cheek. The search, of course, turned up nothing. But that didn't stop Officer Brady. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and suspicious behavior," he declared, reading her rights in a rush, away from the curb, mocking tone, leaving Amy's Honda
As he
behind
pushed
with
her
its
into
doors
the back
still
of his
open.
patrol
Her
car,
belongings
Amy
scattered
held
across
onto
the
one
street.
comforting thought.
The small
Her
crowd
father
of
would know
onlookers
exactly
remained,
what to do.
their phones still
Special
recording.
Agent
Their
Rodriguez
faces
has
a
spent
mix of
20
concern
years in
and
the
anger.
FBI fighting corruption.
One elderly
and
woman
civil
was
rights
already on her
violations.
phone.
Her
Officer
voice
Brady
carrying
had no
clearly through
idea
the
what was
evening air.
coming. "Yes, I need to report a police officer. What I just witnessed was completely unacceptable." Amy closed her eyes in the back of the patrol car, focusing on her breathing just like her mother had taught her in their morning meditation sessions. She knew this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. And when her father found out, things would change, not through violence or revenge, but through the pure, unstoppable force of justice done right. The fluorescent lights at the police station buzzed overhead as Amy sat on the cold metal bench, her hospital volunteer badge now confiscated along with her other belongings. Her wrists still bore red marks from where the handcuffs had been too tight. The booking process had been a blur of fingerprints, photographs, and pointed questions, all while Officer Brady stood nearby with a satisfied smirk on his face. "Look who thinks she's too good to be here," one of Brady's colleagues muttered as he passed by. Amy kept her head high, remembering her mother's words. "Your dignity is something no one can take from you unless you let them." The holding area smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. 2 other women sat nearby. A grandmother who'd been arrested for protesting at City Hall, and a young businesswoman brought in for disturbing the peace while filming a police interaction outside her office. They shared knowing looks but stayed quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. "Chen Rodriguez," a desk sergeant called out, deliberately mangling the pronunciation. "Your phone call. Make it quick." Amy's hands trembled slightly as she dialed her father's number. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar voice answered, "Rodriguez speaking." "Dad," she managed to say, her voice catching. "I need your help. I'm at the central station. Officer Brady, he..." "What?" The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told her everything. Her father knew Brady's reputation. "Are you hurt?" "No, just..." Amy glanced at the desk sergeant watching her. "He said I was resisting, but I wasn't. He searched my car, made a mess of everything. Dad, he wouldn't even tell me why he pulled me over." "Listen carefully, honey. Don't say anything else to anyone. I'm in the middle of wrapping up the Thompson case, but I'm leaving right now. Detective Rivera owes me a favor. I'll have her check on you until I get there. 20 minutes, tops." The line went dead, and Amy was led back to the holding area. Time seemed to crawl. She watched officers shuffle papers, chat over coffee, and process other arrivals. Some tried to intimidate her with stern looks, while others simply ignored her existence. But Amy noticed everything, mentally recording each face, each comment, each small abuse of power, just as her father had taught her. 15 minutes later, a sharp voice cut through the station's dull murmur. "Where is she?" Detective Rivera strode in, her badge prominently displayed, her dark eyes scanning the room. When she spotted Amy, her professional demeanor cracked slightly, showing genuine concern. "This is unacceptable," Rivera announced to no one in particular, though several officers suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. She turned to the desk sergeant. "Why wasn't I notified immediately that we had a federal agent's daughter in custody?" The sergeant mumbled something about proper procedures, but Rivera was already reviewing Amy's paperwork. Her eyebrows rose higher with each page she read. "Resisting an officer? Suspicious behavior?" Rivera's voice dripped with skepticism. "And I suppose the dash cam footage just happened to malfunction again." Officer Brady chose that moment to return from his break. He stopped short at the sight of Detective Rivera, his usual swagger faltering. "Brady," Rivera's tone could have frozen water. "I see you're still writing creative reports. Tell me, did you bother to check her ID properly? Or were you too busy profiling her to notice she's part of the hospital's youth volunteer program?" Brady's face reddened. She was acting suspicious. "Save it for internal affairs," Rivera cut him off. "They'll be very interested in this one, especially since..." She held up her phone, showing a social media video of Amy's arrest that was already going viral. "Your performance had quite an audience." The station's atmosphere had changed completely. Officers who had been smirking earlier now looked uncomfortable. The desk sergeant was suddenly very interested in his computer screen. Brady stood rigid, his jaw working silently. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Amy felt her shoulders relax for the first time since this nightmare began. She didn't need to look up to know who had arrived. Special Agent Rodriguez stood in the doorway, still wearing his FBI windbreaker from the field operation he'd left. His presence seemed to fill the entire room, though he hadn't said a word. His eyes found Amy first, checking her for any signs of injury. Then his gaze swept the room, noting every face, every reaction. "Detective Rivera," he nodded to his colleague. "Thank you for watching over my daughter." His voice was calm, professional, betraying none of the anger Annie knew he must be feeling. "Of course," Rivera replied, handing him the paperwork. "You'll want to see this. All of it." Rodriguez scanned the documents quickly, his expression unchanging. But Emmy saw the small muscle jumping in his jaw, a tell she'd known since childhood. Her father was beyond angry. He was furious. "We'll need copies of everything," he said quietly. "And I mean everything. Booking photos, fingerprints, officer statements, surveillance footage. Detective Rivera, would you mind witnessing as they process my daughter's release?" "My pleasure," Rivera answered, already moving toward the desk sergeant. Brady took a step forward. "Sir, if I could explain." Rodriguez held up one hand, stopping Brady mid-sentence. "Officer Brady, I suggest you contact your union representative. Immediately." His tone made it clear this wasn't friendly advice. As Emmy gathered her belongings, now haphazardly shoved into a property bag, she caught fragments of her father's quiet conversation with Detective Rivera. Words like pattern of behavior and civil rights violations drifted across the room. Walking out of the station beside her father, Amy felt the weight of the past few hours pressing down on her. But mixed with her exhaustion was something else: determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "Dad," she said as they reached his car, "what happens now?" Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Now? Now we make sure this never happens to anyone else's daughter." Special Agent Rodriguez sat in his home office long after midnight, the soft glow of his desk lamp illuminating spread-out papers and his laptop screen. He'd insisted Emmy try to get some sleep, though he could still hear her occasional footsteps upstairs. Neither of them would rest easily tonight. The security footage from the police station played silently on his screen. He'd watched it 12 times now, each viewing stoking the quiet fire in his chest. His daughter's proud posture, even in handcuffs, the way she held her head high despite the obvious fear in her eyes, it made his heart ache and burn with pride at the same time. His wife Lynn appeared in the doorway, 2 steaming cups of tea in her hands. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, placing one cup beside him. Her hand rested gently on his shoulder as she watched the footage play. "You're going to make this right." It wasn't a question. In 20 years of marriage, Lynn had never seen her husband back down from injustice. But she'd also never seen him this focused, this determined. "Brady has a history," Rodriguez said, pulling up another file on his laptop. Detective Rivera sent over some interesting data. In the past 3 years, he's made over 200 suspicious behavior arrests. Want to guess the demographic pattern? Lynn's grip tightened slightly on his shoulder. How many complaints? 47 filed. All dismissed or buried. But look at this. He clicked through several images. Different incidents, different people, same story. Traffic stop for no clear reason. Aggressive search. Trumped-up charges that get dropped once the person spends a night in jail. The clock ticked quietly as they reviewed the evidence together. Posts from community forums described similar encounters. Local news clips showed Brady at the center of other controversies, always somehow emerging unscathed. "He's careful," Rodriguez noted, pointing to a particular report. "Never goes too far. Keeps it just inside the line where each individual incident can be explained away. But when you put it all together..." "A pattern emerges," Lynn finished. She picked up one of the complaint forms, studying it closely. "These people, they tried to speak up. And the system failed them." Rodriguez leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. But this time's different. Brady didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know that Amy's friend at the hospital already sent me the security footage showing her entire shift, proving she couldn't have been doing anything suspicious. Or that Detective Rivera's been building a case against him for months, just waiting for solid evidence. A notification popped up on his screen, an email from an old colleague in the Civil Rights Division. Rodriguez smiled slightly as he read it. "And he definitely didn't know I still have friends in the Justice Department who've been looking for exactly this kind of case." Lynn sat on the edge of his desk, her expression thoughtful. "What about the others? The ones who filed complaints before?" "I've got their contact information right here." Rodriguez patted a folder beside him. Once we build our case properly, their testimonies will matter. Brady's not just going to lose his badge, he's going to face real consequences. And more importantly, we're going to expose the system that protected him. Footsteps on the stairs made them both look up. Amy stood in the doorway, still in her clothes from earlier, her eyes tired but alert. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. Lynn opened her arms, and Amy crossed the room to accept her mother's embrace. "I keep thinking about the other people in the holding cell," Amy said quietly. "The grandmother who was protesting. The businesswoman who was just trying to help someone. How many others have there been?" Rodriguez turned his laptop so Amy could see the screen. "That's exactly what we're going to find out. But we're going to do this right. No shortcuts. No revenge tactics. Just solid police work and the full force of the law." Amy studied the files with growing understanding. "You're building more than just a case against Brady, aren't you?" "Smart girl," her father smiled proudly. "Brady's just a symptom. The real problem is the system that lets officers like him operate with impunity. The missing complaint files, the conveniently broken cameras, the charges that disappear before they can be properly investigated, it all points to a bigger issue. And that's why you haven't stormed into the precinct demanding his badge," Amy realized. "Exactly. Brady's expecting that. He's probably got his story ready, his union rep on speed dial. But he's not expecting a full federal investigation. He's not expecting us to uncover every case, talk to every victim, and document every abuse of power. And he's certainly not expecting us to use his own routine against him." Lynn picked up another file, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. "Your father always says the best way to fight corruption is with patience and paperwork." "And the truth," Rodriguez added, reaching for his tea. "The truth has a way of demanding to be heard. We just have to make sure we gather enough voices to make it impossible to ignore." Amy pulled up a chair, her exhaustion forgotten as she looked at the evidence her father had already assembled. "Where do we start?" Rodriguez shared a knowing look with his wife before turning back to his daughter. "We start with the basics. Every good investigation begins the same way, following the paper trail, connecting the dots, and most importantly, listening to the people who've been silenced for too long." As the night deepened outside their window, the Rodriguez family began their work. Their dining room table slowly transformed into a command center covered with documents, timelines, and witness statements. They were no longer just seeking justice for one incident, they were building a case that would shake an entire corrupt system to its foundations. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filled the plastic chairs. Rodriguez watched from the back of the room as his daughter spoke with a small group near the podium. In the weeks since her arrest, Amy had transformed her anger into action, organizing this meeting through her hospital volunteer network. "I never thought anyone would listen," an elderly woman whispered to Amy, clutching a manila envelope full of documents. "When they dismissed my complaint about Officer Brady, I felt so helpless." "Not anymore," Amy assured her, her voice gentle but firm. "Every story matters. Every piece of evidence counts." Rodriguez felt a presence beside him and turned to find Detective Rivera, coffee cup in hand. "Your daughter's something else," she said quietly. "Half these people wouldn't have come forward if she hadn't reached out personally." "She gets that from her mother," Rodriguez replied, pride evident in his voice. "Lynn taught her that healing comes from helping others." Rivera nodded toward her phone. "Speaking of help, Internal Affairs is actually doing their job for once. My contact says they're reviewing every complaint filed against Brady and his closest colleagues for the past 5 years." 5 years isn't enough, Rodriguez muttered, watching more people file into the room. "But it's a start." The crowd grew larger than expected. Hospital workers who'd witnessed Brady's harassment of patients. Small business owners who'd seen him target their customers. Teachers, students, retail workers, each with a story, each holding onto evidence they'd thought would never matter. Amy stepped up to the podium, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for coming today. I know it's not easy to speak up, to relive these experiences. But by sharing our stories, by standing together, we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As people began sharing their experiences, Rodriguez noticed patterns emerging. Brady wasn't working alone. Certain names kept coming up, officers who would back his stories, desk surgeons who would lose paperwork, supervisors who would dismiss complaints without investigation. A young store clerk described how Brady had demanded free coffee every morning, then started writing parking tickets for any customer who refused to serve him first. A nurse recounted how Brady had intimidated patients who tried to file complaints about rough treatment. Rodriguez's phone buzzed, a message from his contact in the Justice Department. He stepped into the hallway to read it, a small smile forming as he scanned the contents. "Good news?" Rivera asked, following him out. "Very. The Civil Rights Division is officially interested. They've been looking for a case that could expose systemic problems in local departments. This might be it." Rivera let out a low whistle. "Brady has no idea what's coming, does he?" "Neither does the whole department," Rodriguez replied, scrolling through more messages. "My contact says they're particularly interested in the pattern of dismissed complaints. Could point to corruption at higher levels." Back in the meeting room, Amy was now helping people fill out official statements, her pre-med precision showing in how carefully she documented each detail. The elderly woman from earlier was showing her photos saved on an old flip phone, evidence she'd kept for years, waiting for someone to take her seriously. Rodriguez's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Lynn, Channel 5 reporter asking questions about Brady. Apparently there's footage from other incidents. "Media's getting interested," he showed the message to Rivera. "Think your internal affairs contact can handle the spotlight?" "He better," Rivera answered, "because this is bigger than Brady now. This is about every officer who thought they could abuse their power without consequences." A young man approached them, nervously clutching his phone. "Detective Rivera, I work at the gas station on Pine Street. Our security cameras, they caught something last month. Officer Brady and some others, they were talking about how they handle complaints. I didn't know what to do with it before, but now." Rivera took his statement while Rodriguez watched Emmy organizing the growing pile of evidence. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod. She was okay, she was strong. Stronger than he'd ever imagined. His phone buzzed one final time that evening. A message from his Justice Department contact that made him straighten up. "They're sending a team," he told Rivera after reading it twice to be sure. "Full investigation into departmental practices, focusing on civil rights violations and systemic abuse of power. They want everything we've gathered." "Everything?" Rivera glanced at the room full of people still sharing their stories. "That's going to be one hell of a report." "It's not just a report anymore," Rodriguez said, watching his daughter help another person document their experience. "It's a reckoning. Brady thought he could intimidate my daughter because she was an easy target. Instead, he gave her the push she needed to become a voice for everyone he's ever wronged." The meeting continued well into the evening. People who'd entered scared and uncertain left standing taller, knowing they were finally being heard. Annie collected contact information, organized evidence, and promised follow-ups. She was no longer just a victim of Brady's abuse. She'd become a leader in the fight against it. As they packed up the last of the documents, Amy turned to her father. "Do you think it will be enough?" Rodriguez looked at the boxes of evidence, the stack of sworn statements, the videos and photos, and carefully documented patterns of abuse. But more importantly, he looked at the strength in his daughter's eyes, the determination that had brought all these people together. "More than enough," he assured her. Brady thought he could silence one voice. Instead, he woke up hundreds. And now they're all going to be heard. The FBI field office hummed with activity as Rodriguez spread documents across the conference room table. 3 weeks had passed since the community meeting, and the investigation had grown far beyond what anyone expected. Detective Rivera stood by the whiteboard, connecting red streams between photos of officers and incidents. "Look at this pattern," she said, tapping a cluster of pins. Every time Brady worked the night shift with officers Thompson and Wilson, there was at least one questionable arrest. Always the same charges: resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, interfering with police business. Rodriguez nodded, pulling up financial records on his laptop. "And here's where it gets interesting. Those nights also saw increased activity at local businesses, particularly this coffee shop, this gas station, and this convenience store." "Protection money?" Rivera's eyes narrowed. "More like unofficial taxes," Rodriguez replied. "Small amounts, just enough to stay under the radar." But multiply that by 3 years, dozens of businesses. The door opened and Amy walked in, carrying a stack of fresh statements. She'd been volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other victims document their experiences. Dark circles under her eyes showed her exhaustion, but there was a fire in her expression that hadn't dimmed. The store owner on Oak Street finally agreed to talk, she announced, adding her papers to the growing pile. He kept every receipt from the donations Brady and his friends demanded. Said he was too scared to come forward before, but now? Rodriguez squeezed his daughter's shoulder proudly. Her arrest had started as a nightmare, but she turned it into a mission. The legal aid clinic had even offered her a part-time job, impressed by her dedication to helping others seek justice. Your mom called, he told her. The Justice Department team wants to meet tomorrow. They're particularly interested in the financial aspects we've uncovered. Amy pulled up a chair, studying the whiteboard. It's not just about racial profiling anymore, is it? This is organized corruption. Exactly, Rivera confirmed. Brady and his crew created a system. Target vulnerable people, pressure local businesses, bury complaints through their connections in internal affairs. Classic protection racket wearing police badges. Rodriguez's phone buzzed, a message from his contact in the Civil Rights Division. His eyebrows rose as he read it. Well, this changes things. They've been monitoring Brady's recent activities. Apparently, he knows we're building a case. Is he backing down? Amy asked. Quite the opposite. He's getting sloppy, aggressive. Made 3 questionable arrests last week alone. He thinks his connections will protect him, just like always. Rivera shook her head. He doesn't realize those connections are already abandoning ship. My internal affairs contact says 2 surgeons have already come forward, offering to testify about altered reports and buried complaints. Amy stood up, walking to the evidence wall where dozens of photos told stories of lives impacted by Brady's abuse of power. All these people trusted the system to protect them. When it failed, they felt helpless, alone. Not anymore, Rodriguez assured her, watching his daughter trace the connections between cases. Each person who speaks up gives others courage. Brady's biggest mistake wasn't targeting you. It was creating so many victims that when one person finally stood up, the whole wall of silence came crashing down. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young agent entered, carrying a thick folder. Sir, you need to see this. Tech team finished analyzing Brady's work phone records. Looks like he was coordinating with someone higher up in the department. Rodriguez took the folder, scanning its contents with growing interest. Well, looks like our corrupt officer has friends in very interesting places. How high does it go? Rivera asked, peering over his shoulder. All the way to the deputy commissioner's office, Rodriguez replied grimly. Monthly meetings, always off the books. Large cash deposits in multiple accounts right after each meeting. Amy's eyes widened. So when complaints about Brady disappeared, they weren't just getting lost in the system, Rivera finished. They were being actively buried by someone with serious authority. Rodriguez started organizing the documents into separate files. We need to move fast now. Once Brady realizes we're not just looking at him, but at the whole corrupt network. He might try to destroy evidence, Andy concluded. Or worse, Rivera added. Men like Brady, when they're backed into a corner. Rodriguez's phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. He held it up for the others to see. PULACMISCONDUCT Investigation YDNs Multiple Officios implicated. Looks like the media's catching up, Rivera noted. Good, Amy said firmly. Let everyone see what's been happening. No more shadows for them to hide in. Rodriguez watched his daughter's determination with a mixture of pride and concern. She'd grown so much through this ordeal, turning victim into advocate, fear into strength. But he also knew the most dangerous part was still ahead. Tomorrow's meeting with the Justice Department team is crucial, he told them. We need everything perfect, every piece of evidence documented, every witness statement verified, every financial connection traced. Amy nodded, already reaching for another stack of documents. Then we better get back to work. These people are counting on us. As the evening deepened, they continued building their case. The whiteboard filled with more connections, more evidence of corruption that had festered for years. But now, finally, the truth was coming to light. Brady might have thought he was untouchable, protected by a system he'd learned to manipulate. But he never counted on facing an FBI agent with the resources to expose that system, a detective brave enough to challenge it from within, and a young woman whose determination would inspire others to finally speak up. The police commissioner's office felt smaller than Rodriguez remembered. Maybe it was the presence of the Justice Department team, or maybe it was the weight of the evidence boxes stacked on the conference table. Detective Rivera stood beside him, while Amy sat quietly in the corner, taking notes just as she did during her hospital volunteer shifts. The commissioner's face had grown increasingly pale as he reviewed the files. This is extensive. That's one word for it, the Justice Department lead investigator replied. She was a sharp-eyed woman who'd spent 20 years prosecuting police corruption cases. I'd call it systematic abuse of power myself. Rodriguez watched the commissioner flip through more pages, witness statements, financial records, internal communications that painted a damning picture. The man's hands trembled slightly when he reached the section about his deputy's involvement. I had no idea, the commissioner started, but Rivera cut him off. With all due respect, sir, that's part of the problem. These complaints were filed. Reports were made. The system you oversee was designed to catch exactly this kind of corruption. Instead, it protected it. Outside the office windows, news vans were already gathering. Someone had leaked details to the media, not the full story, but enough to draw attention. Rodriguez had a pretty good idea who was responsible. His wife, Lynn, had always said sometimes you had to shine a light to make the cockroaches scatter. The commissioner's phone buzzed. His face grew even paler as he read the message. Channel 5 has footage. Multiple incidents. They're running it tonight. Actually, Amy spoke up for the first time, her voice clear and steady. They're running it right now. Live stream started 2 minutes ago. Everyone's phones started buzzing at once as the story broke across social media. Rodriguez pulled up the feed on his tablet. There it was, security camera footage, cell phone videos, documented patterns of abuse spanning years. And at the center of it all, Officer Brady's face, caught in the act over and over again. This isn't just about Brady anymore, the Justice Department investigator stated firmly. We've uncovered evidence of systematic corruption, abuse of power, and civil rights violations involving multiple officers and supervisors. The deputy commissioner's involvement alone. A commotion outside the office interrupted her. Through the glass walls, they could see Officer Brady storming toward the office, his face red with rage. 2 security officers moved to intercept him, but he was already shouting. You think you can do this to me? I've got dirt on everyone. You can't touch me. The commissioner reached for his phone, but Rodriguez held up a hand. Wait, let's hear what he has to say. Brady burst into the office, then froze when he saw the assembled group. His eyes locked onto Amy, and for a moment his mask slipped. Fear flashed across his face as he realized just how thoroughly he'd miscalculated that night. Officer Brady, the Justice Department investigator, said calmly, "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the pattern of financial transactions between you and several local businesses. Would you care to explain these deposits?" "I want my union rep," Brady stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "They're already here," Rivera informed him, gesturing to the hallway where 2 union representatives were hurrying toward the office. "They've been very interested in our evidence. Seems they don't appreciate their organization being used to shield corrupt officers." Brady's face went from red to white. "You don't understand. I was following orders." "The deputy commissioner," he said. "We know exactly what he said," Rodriguez cut in. "We have the recordings." That was a bluff. They didn't have recordings. But Brady didn't know that, and his reaction told them everything. He collapsed into a chair, the fight draining out of him. "I want a deal," he whispered. "That's not up to us," the Justice Department investigator replied. "But cooperation will be taken into consideration, starting with a full account of every officer involved in your little operation." Amy stood up, walking to the window. Below, more news vans were arriving. Citizens were gathering too, faces she recognized from the community meetings, people who'd shared their stories, who'd dared to hope that this time would be different. "Commissioner," she said, still watching the growing crowd. There are people down there who lost faith in the system you represent, who felt powerless against officers who abused their authority. They deserve to know that things will change." The commissioner joined her at the window. After a long moment, he nodded. "You're right." He turned to his assistant. "Set up a press conference. Right now, it's time for full transparency." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Brady was escorted out, not in handcuffs, but certainly no longer strutting. The deputy commissioner was called in for questioning. More officers came forward, some to confess, others to provide evidence against their corrupt colleagues. Rodriguez watched it all unfold, standing beside his daughter as she continued taking notes. "You know," he said quietly, "when I taught you about justice, I never imagined you'd end up teaching me." Amy looked up from her notebook. "What do you mean?" "I wanted to protect you, to fight this battle for you. But you showed me it wasn't just about us. You made it about everyone who'd been wronged. You gave them a voice." Through the window, they could see the commissioner stepping up to the microphones. Camera lights flashed as he began to speak. "Today, we announce a complete overhaul of our department's oversight and accountability systems." "It's really happening," Amy whispered. "Yes," Rodriguez agreed, watching Brady being led to a waiting car, his head bowed. "And this is just the beginning. Real change takes time, but it starts with moments like this, when people finally see the truth and decide they won't accept anything less than justice." 6 months later, the community center was packed again, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different from that first nervous meeting. Sunlight streamed through the windows as Amy stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had become like family. "When Officer Brady pulled me over that night, he thought he was just carrying out another routine abuse of power," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "He had no idea he was about to bring together a community that would change everything." The crowd included familiar faces: the grandmother who'd kept years of evidence on her flip phone, the store clerk who'd documented the protection money scheme, the nurse who'd stood up for harassed patients. But there were new faces too, including several police officers who had helped expose the corruption from within. Detective Rivera sat in the front row, now wearing the badge of Internal Affairs Director. The department's new oversight committee had chosen her specifically because of her role in breaking the case. Beside her sat Lynn, who had turned her business skills to helping run the newly formed Citizens Advisory Board. "The numbers tell part of the story," and he continued, changing the slide behind her. 12 officers removed from duty, 3 supervisors facing criminal charges, 1 deputy commissioner resigned in disgrace. But the real story isn't about what we took down, it's about what we built in its place. Rodriguez watched from the back of the room, just as he had 6 months ago. But now he wasn't watching alone. The Justice Department investigator stood beside him, nodding approvingly at the presentation. "Your daughter's report is excellent," she whispered. "We're using it as a model for community-led police reform in other cities." On stage, Annie clicked to the next slide. "Our new Civilian Oversight Committee has reviewed over 300 past cases, resulting in 47 overturned convictions. But more importantly, complaints against officers are down 60% because officers know they'll be held accountable." She gestured to a group of new police recruits sitting together in their uniforms. "Every new officer now goes through enhanced training that we helped develop. They learn about implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of community trust. And they hear directly from people who experienced abuse of power, so they understand what's at stake." The elderly woman who'd first shared her story at that initial meeting raised her hand. "What happened to Brady?" Amy smiled gently. "Officer Brady accepted a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against higher-ups involved in the corruption, he received a reduced sentence. He'll never wear a badge again, and more importantly, the system that protected him has been dismantled." She clicked to a new slide showing the police department's updated complaint process. "Now, every complaint is reviewed by both Internal Affairs and our Civilian Board. Body camera footage can't mysteriously disappear anymore. Officers can't pressure businesses for donations or target people based on race or appearance." From his spot in the back, Rodriguez noticed a familiar face slipping into the room: the commissioner. He'd kept his job by fully cooperating with the investigation and championing the reforms, proving that leadership could adapt when held accountable. "But the biggest change," and he continued, her voice growing passionate, is in this room. Look around. Community members, police officers, city officials, all working together. When I started volunteering at the hospital, I learned that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about making something stronger in the broken places. She gestured to a table covered with pamphlets. That's why we're expanding our advocacy network. Free legal aid for anyone experiencing police misconduct, support groups for survivors, educational programs about civil rights. The help I wish I'd had that night, available to everyone. The commissioner stepped forward then, waiting his turn to speak. When he reached the podium, his words were simple but powerful. 6 months ago, this community showed us what real accountability looks like. You didn't just demand change, you showed us how to make it happen. Every department in the country is watching what we've accomplished here. After the formal presentation, people mingled, sharing stories and plans for future initiatives. Annie found herself surrounded by young people interested in joining the civilian oversight program. Lynn was deep in conversation with business owners about community policing initiatives. Rivera was explaining the new complaint process to a group of concerned citizens. Rodriguez finally made his way to his daughter, wrapping her in a proud embrace. Not bad for 6 months' work. Amy smiled, but her eyes were already focused on the future. We're just getting started, Dad. Other cities are reaching out, wanting to learn from what we did here. They have their own Officer Brady's, their own broken systems. And now they know change is possible, he agreed. A young police recruit approached them hesitantly. Ms. Rodriguez, your story, it's part of our training now. It helps us understand why trust is so important, why every interaction matters. Amy shook the recruit's hand firmly. Then remember this part too, it's not about perfect police officers. It's about creating a system where accountability isn't optional and where the community has a real voice. As the evening wound down, Rodriguez watched his daughter speaking with a reporter, explaining their plans to expand the program statewide. She no longer looked like someone who had been victimized by the system. She looked like someone who had changed it. You know, Lynn said, joining him, when you first started investigating Brady, I thought you were seeking revenge. But Amy showed us both something better. Rodriguez nodded, watching the room full of people working together for real change. She showed us that true justice isn't about punishing bad actors, it's about fixing broken systems and healing communities. Brady thought he could silence one voice that night. Instead, he awakened thousands. Outside, the sun was setting on another day in a city that had learned to believe in justice again. Not perfect justice, but justice that was always striving to be better, always willing to listen, always ready to change. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.